So for my policy brief, I did the government's influence on the opioid epidemic. So the target audience are average community members because they are the most important consumers of opioids. They are the ones prescribed opioids for simple procedures such as a wisdom teeth removal. They are the ones whose healthcare could be altered with possible policy development, and they might know someone suffering with an opioid addiction, or they might even be suffering themselves. So some important statistics are in 2018, 70% of the more than 67,000 people who died from a drug overdose had an illicit opioid involved. So 2 out of every 3 drug overdoses were due to an illicit opioid. Before restrictive programs were put into place, 88% of prescriptions from retail pharmacy were for opioids, and these prescriptions included refills. So we see this increase starting at 1999. It's a steady increase, and then all of a sudden it shoots up in around 2013 and really spikes at 2015, and the peak is in 2017. So we see this with the 3 waves of the opioid epidemic that the CDC has graphed for us. So again, starting in 1999, there's a rise in the prescription opioid overdose deaths because of how addictive and fatal they are. And between 1999 and probably 2005, not many people knew how fatal they are until they started to see this rise. And then in 2010, we see the addition of heroin. And when heroin was involved, there was another spike in deaths. And then in 2013, we really see a huge spike in deaths because these synthetic opioids were being laced with fentanyl and other very fatal drugs. And then this matches this graph here where you see in 2015 the really, really big spike in opioid deaths. So the problem is that there is a very easy access to opioids in the United States. There are very few restrictions on prescription of opioids. Really, the only restrictions are on the long-lasting and extended release opioids, which are more addictive, but the normal opioids are very addictive as well. So there's little access to help centers in the United States. There aren't many, and the ones that there are very expensive and hard to get into because it isn't covered by insurance. There's also little access to opioid alternatives, and not many are covered by healthcare or insurance, so not covered by insurance. So they're very expensive. There's not many, so like a lot of people will resort to opioids because they're cheaper and more well-known and found. And due to this lack of access, there's an increased use of heroin and synthetic opioids because of the addition of restrictive programs, but then taking away the cheaper opioids has caused the turn to the more dangerous drugs. So policy development, if we were to move forward, would include more restrictions on opioid prescriptions. It would also include coverage of opioid alternatives as a part of healthcare. And then we also need to create better access to opioid rehabilitation centers or counseling. There needs to be an increased access to naloxone, which is the drug used to reverse an opioid overdose. This is very hard to find and very expensive, but if we were to manufacture more and make it easier to access, we could save more lives. So another really important aspect to decrease the opioid epidemic is public awareness. So by increasing public knowledge of opioid misuse, we can make more people will be making safer choices because they know of the consequences of opioids. And then this will also put added pressure on legislation to create policies that will possibly end the opioid epidemic, because as seen in this graph, every single state has cases, and also Alaska and Hawaii do, but they're not on this map, but they do have cases. And if we were to all come together and push legislation, we could really make change. So some next steps. So as a community, we can write to our senators and representatives to support policy development that will create better access to those suffering from an opioid addiction, because they can have alternatives and they can seek help. And then by increasing public awareness, we need to educate those around us. So just, again, making a bigger group to support ending the opioid epidemic. And lastly, we need to continue to support those struggling with addiction and try and help find them help. So here's my works cited, and thank you so much for listening.